A widowed father, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, is humiliated in front of the whole town when all he's left in a will is a battered, worthless piano. The varnish is chipped, the keys are dead, and the local big shots laugh like they've just watched him lose the last shred of his dignity. But one strange click of a key changes everything. Hidden inside secret letters, mysterious keys, and a decades-old map leading to a treasure no one was ever supposed to find. Now, with a greedy developer closing in, whispers of a stolen legacy and a fortune worth more than the town itself. This single dad must decide, fight for the truth or lose it all. What will he risk when the music that could save his community might also destroy it? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees, sending crimson leaves dancing across the driveway of Mrs. Lillian Moore's Victorian home. Zeke Carter gripped the steering wheel of his weathered pickup truck, his calloused hand steady despite the flutter of anxiety in his stomach. Next to him, his daughter Maya sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap. "You okay, sweetie?" Zeke asked, glancing at his 10-year-old daughter. Maya nodded, though her eyes were fixed on the small crowd gathered in front of Mrs. Moore's house. "There's a lot of people here." Zeke couldn't blame her for being nervous. The collection of well-dressed townsfolk standing around the property made him feel out of place in his worn work jacket and faded jeans. He recognized most of them, the type of people who ran the town but rarely spoke to folks like him except to give orders. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, he spotted Dean Whitford's sleek Mercedes parked near the garage. The developer stood chatting with a group of people, his expensive suit jacket catching the morning sun. "Remember what Mrs. Moore always said?" Zeke smiled at Maya, trying to ease her tension. Head up, heart open. Maya's lips curved into a small smile. "I miss her, Dad." "Me too, baby. Me too." They climbed out of the truck, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. The executor of Mrs. Moore's estate, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, waved them over. "Mr. Carter, right on time." Dean Whitford's conversation died down as he turned to watch, his perfectly white teeth showing in what might have been a smile or a smirk. The other onlookers didn't even try to hide their stares. "Mrs. Moore was very specific about this item in her will," the executor explained, leading them toward the house's side door. "She wanted you to have it, Mr. Carter." Inside the garage, covered in an old sheet, sat what was clearly a piano. Zeke's heart squeezed. He remembered Maya sitting at that piano years ago, her small fingers picking out simple tunes, while Mrs. Moore encouraged her with gentle words and cookies. The executor pulled away the sheet, revealing a battered upright piano. The dark wood was scratched and worn, its varnish peeling in places. Zeke ran his hand along its side, feeling every nick and dent. "Well, would you look at that?" Dean Whitford's voice carried from the doorway. "Lillian left you her old junker, Carter." Several people chuckled. Zeke kept his eyes on the piano, noticing how Maya pressed closer to his side. "Try the keys," someone called out. Zeke lifted the fall board, exposing the yellowed ivory keys. When he pressed middle C, the hammer moved but no sound came out. He tried a few more keys, all dead silent. "Looks like you got yourself some fancy firewood there, soldier." Dean's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Shame to waste garage space on it all these years." More laughter followed. Zeke felt Maya's small hand slip into his, squeezing tight. He squeezed back, remembering how Mrs. Moore used to say that dignity wasn't about what others thought of you, but what you knew about yourself. The piano meant something to Mrs. Moore, Zeke said quietly, more to Maya than anyone else. "That's what matters. Need help loading it?" the executor asked kindly. "Got my tools in the truck," Zeke replied. "Maya, honey, can you grab the moving blankets?" They worked methodically, ignoring the whispers and stares. Zeke removed the legs and carefully wrapped each piece. Years of military logistics and handyman work had taught him how to handle delicate items, no matter their condition. As they secured the piano in the truck bed, Zeke noticed something carved into the back panel, an ugly word that made his jaw clench. He quickly covered it with a blanket before Maya could see it. Dean sauntered over as they finished tying everything down. "You know, Carter, if you need some extra cash, I could use another maintenance man at my new development. Probably pay better than hauling around broken pianos." "We're doing just fine, Mr. Whitford," Zeke replied evenly. "But thank you for your concern." The drive home was quiet, save for the occasional rattle from the truck bed. Maya kept glancing back through the rear window, as if making sure the piano was still there. "Dad?" she finally asked. "Why were they being mean about the piano?" Zeke thought carefully before answering. "Some people judge things, and people, by what they look like on the outside. Mrs. Moore wasn't like that. Remember how she always said music comes from the heart, not just the instrument?" Maya nodded. "She let me practice there when we couldn't afford lessons." "That's right. And she never once made us feel bad about it." Their modest craftsman home looked welcoming in the golden evening light. The porch needed painting and the steps creaked, but it was theirs. Zeke backed the truck up to the front door and began the careful process of unloading. It took over an hour to reassemble the piano in their small living room. Maya helped hold the legs steady while Zeke attached them, just like they did with all his repair projects. When they finally stood back, the piano looked both out of place and somehow right at home among their worn furniture. Zeke wiped his brow with his sleeve, exhausted but satisfied they'd at least given Mrs. Moore's gift a proper welcome. "Time for bed, Maya. We can clean it up tomorrow." "Okay, Dad." She hugged him tight around the waist. "I'm glad Mrs. Moore gave it to us, even if it doesn't work." "Me too, baby." He kissed the top of her head. "Me too." Later, after Maya was asleep, Zeke sat in his recliner looking at the silent piano. The mockery from earlier still stung, but something about the instrument's quiet presence felt like Mrs. Moore was still watching over them, still believing in them when others didn't. He turned off the living room light and headed to bed, his muscles aching from the day's work. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more judgment from people like Dean Whitford, but for now he had given Mrs. Moore's piano a home. Sometimes, he thought, that was enough. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Zeke poured his coffee, the rich aroma filling their small home. The sound of Maya quietly testing piano keys drifted in from the living room, gentle, experimental taps that made no sound but showed her natural curiosity. "Breakfast in 10 minutes, sweetheart," he called out, cracking eggs into a bowl. "Okay." "Dad." Maya's voice held that focused tone she got when she was deep in concentration. Zeke smiled, whisking the eggs. The piano might not work, but it already felt like part of their home. He'd have to figure out how to restore it somehow, even if the town's elite thought it was worthless. A sharp click from the living room made him pause. "Maya? Everything okay?" "Dad!" Maya's voice lifted with excitement. "Dad, come look!" Zeke set down the whisk and hurried into the living room. Maya sat at the piano bench, her eyes wide as she pointed to a narrow panel that had popped open beneath the middle section of keys. "I just pressed this one," she demonstrated with middle C, "and something clicked, and this opened up." Zeke knelt beside the bench, peering into the hidden compartment. Inside lay several objects carefully wrapped in faded velvet. A set of ivory keytops, yellowed with age but intact. A small ring holding what looked like brass keys, each one numbered, and a stack of letters in aged envelopes, their paper delicate and brown at the edges. "What are those stamps, Dad?" Maya pointed to the ornate seal, pressed into each envelope, an elegant S with flourishes. "Steinway," Zeke breathed, recognizing the famous piano maker's mark. He carefully lifted out one of the letters, handling it like the precious artifact it clearly was. Maya leaned against his shoulder as he unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was graceful, written in fading ink. "To the AME Church Committee, 1963 Re. Conservatorship of Instruments, dearest friends. The arrangements are complete. The heritage instruments have been placed in the designated safe havens as marked on the enclosed blueprint. Each guardian has been entrusted with their respective key. May these vessels of grace remain protected until they can sing freely again. Zeke's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the accompanying document, a detailed map of their town, marked with tiny piano icons in various locations. Some he recognized: the old music hall, a defunct school auditorium, the bell tower of the historic AME church. "We should show Mrs. Price," Maya said firmly. "She knows everything about the old church." Zeke nodded slowly. If anyone would understand these letters, it would be Alberta Price. The retired choir director had been a living archive of their community's history for longer than Zeke had been alive. They found Mrs. Price in her garden, tending to her prized roses despite the morning chill. Her silver hair caught the sunlight as she straightened up at their approach, lips curving into a warm smile. "Well, if it isn't the Carters," bright and early. She peered at them over her reading glasses, and carrying what looks like history in those careful hands. Inside her cozy living room, surrounded by old photographs and choir awards, they spread the letters on her coffee table. Mrs. Price's expression grew more serious with each document she examined. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, touching one signature with reverent fingers. "Marcus Jefferson. He was a concert pianist who used to stay here during his tours. Refused to play segregated venues." She pointed to another name. "And Elizabeth Steinway herself. She helped arrange safe storage for instruments at risk during those terrible times." "Safe storage?" Zeke asked. Mrs. Price nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "There were folks who didn't want certain communities to have fine things, especially not precious instruments. Some tried burning down venues, seizing property. These letters," she tapped them gently, "these tell a story of people working together to protect something beautiful." Maya, who had been quietly taking everything in, spoke up. "Is that why the piano has that hidden spot? To keep secrets safe?" "Smart girl," Mrs. Price smiled. "Those pianos were more than just instruments. They were symbols of dignity, of rising above what others thought we deserved." She turned to Zeke. "That old upright you inherited? It's what we called a keeper, one that remembers where the others sleep." Zeke spread out the blueprint on the table. "And these marks? They show where?" "Where certain Steinways were hidden," Mrs. Price confirmed. "Fine instruments, carefully preserved. Some of the best pianos ever made." She adjusted her glasses, studying the map, though whether they're still there after all these years. Her voice trailed off as she noticed something in one letter's margin. "Oh my." She pointed to a small notation. "This is Howard Matthews' handwriting. He was our church treasurer, kept immaculate records of everything, including—" She raised her eyes to Zeke's. "Serial numbers." The weight of what they'd discovered settled over the room. Maya pressed closer to Zeke's side, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Mrs. Price carefully gathered the letters, her movements deliberate. "Child," she said to Zeke, her voice low and serious, "you've stumbled into something powerful, and powerful things have a way of drawing both angels and wolves." That night, long after Maya had gone to bed, Zeke sat in the living room. The blueprint lay on his coffee table, its piano icon seeming to glow in the lamplight. He traced each location with his finger, wondering about the instruments that might still be hidden in those places, preserved like time capsules of hope and resilience. The broken piano stood silent against the wall, no longer just a source of mockery, but a keeper of secrets that could change everything. Sleep felt impossible as questions filled his mind. How many pianos? Where were they now? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do with this knowledge? The Saturday morning sky hung low and gray as Zeke's pickup truck rumbled through the quiet streets. Maya sat beside him, clutching the blueprint and a heavy-duty flashlight to her chest. The damp air made the old music hall's brick walls look darker, almost forbidding. You sure about this, sweetheart? Zeke glanced at his daughter as he parked in the empty lot behind the building. We could wait for more people. Mrs. Price said she'd meet us here, Maya reminded him, already reaching for her door handle. And look, there's her car. Sure enough, Mrs. Price's well-maintained Oldsmobile sat a few spaces away. The elderly woman herself stood near the building's side entrance, wrapped in a warm cardigan despite the mild temperature. Right on time, Mrs. Price called out softly as they approached. She held up a ring of keys similar to the ones they'd found in the piano. I've been the building committee secretary for 30 years. Never knew why we kept this particular key, but could never bring myself to throw it away either. Zeke pulled out brass key, 3 from his pocket, comparing it to Mrs. Price's copy. They matched perfectly. Maya, shine the light here, please, he said, bending to examine the old lock. The key slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these years for their arrival. The door creaked open into a narrow hallway. Their footsteps echoed on the worn linoleum as they made their way to the basement stairs. The musty smell of age and disuse grew stronger as they descended. Watch your step now, Mrs. Price cautioned, one hand on the railing. These stairs haven't seen much traffic lately. Maya's flashlight beam bounced across the basement walls, illuminating stacks of folding chairs, old theater props, and boxes of forgotten programs. Dust motes danced in the light. The blueprint shows it should be in the northwest corner, Maya said, consulting the map, behind something called the prop wall. I remember that, Mrs. Price nodded. There used to be a false wall of sorts, made from old set pieces, helped hide things we wanted to protect. They picked their way carefully through the basement's maze of stored items. Zeke moved aside several stacked chairs, revealing a collection of wooden panels painted to look like brick and stone. Here, he said, carefully sliding the panels away. There's something big behind these. As the last panel moved, their flashlight beams fell on a large shape covered in heavy canvas. The fabric was gray with dust but still intact, carefully tied down with rope that had aged to a dull brown. Maya stepped forward, running her fingers reverently across the canvas surface. It feels important, she whispered. Zeke found a tag attached to one corner, its paper yellow and crisp with age. The handwriting matched the letters they'd found, neat, precise strokes documenting a serial number and date from 1963. Mrs. Price adjusted her glasses, leaning close to examine the tag. That's Howard Matthews' handwriting again, she confirmed. He was so particular about his record-keeping, thank the Lord for that now. Working together, they carefully untied the ropes and began rolling back the canvas. The rich gleam of polished wood emerged inch by inch, surprisingly well preserved in its careful wrapping. Oh my, Mrs. Price breathed as the piano's full shape emerged. It's the Model D Concert Grand, Steinway's finest. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the fallboard. We used to dream about having one of these in our sanctuary. Maya circled the instrument slowly, taking in every detail. Look how big it is, she said softly. And it's so beautiful, even in the dark. Zeke stood back, overwhelmed by what they'd found. The piano was magnificent, nearly 9 feet long, its wood still gleaming despite decades in hiding. He thought of the mockery he'd endured over the broken upright, and for the first time since that day, he felt something other than shame. Pride straightened his shoulders as he watched his daughter examine their discovery. The serial number matches the one in the letters, Mrs. Price confirmed, comparing the tag to a note in her purse. This is definitely one of ours, and if this one's here, then the others might be right where the blueprint says, Maya finished, her voice full of wonder. They worked together to carefully replace the canvas covering, making sure it was secured as they'd found it. The prop wall went back in place, hiding their secret once more. Standing in the dim basement, the three of them exchanged glances filled with awe and possibility. The blueprint Maya held was no longer just a curious old document, it was a treasure map leading to more pianos like this one, waiting to be found. "What do we do now?" Maya asked, looking up at her father. Mrs. Price answered before Zeke could. "Now, we be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. We document everything carefully, then check the next location on that map. And we pray for guidance about who to trust with what we've found." Zeke nodded, looking at the hidden piano one last time before they headed upstairs. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, but it felt different from his usual burdens. This weight came with purpose, with the chance to be part of something larger than himself. As they emerged into the gray morning light, Maya slipped her small hand into his. "Dad?" she said quietly. "I think Mrs. Moore knew exactly what she was doing when she gave you that piano." "I think you're right, baby girl," he replied, squeezing her hand. "I think you're right." The late Sunday afternoon sun slanted through the Carters' living room windows, casting long shadows across the blueprint spread on their coffee table. Zeke and Maya sat cross-legged on the floor, still in their church clothes, studying the map's faded markings. "This one's different from the music hall," Maya said, pointing to a square marked with a tiny piano icon. "It's got a star next to it." Zeke leaned closer, adjusting his reading glasses. The municipal storage annex sat at the edge of town, a plain brick building he'd driven past countless times without a second thought. Now it held new significance. "That's where Dean Whitford's company keeps their equipment," he said, frowning. "Saw their trucks there last week, but they only lease part of it, right?" Maya traced the building's outline on the blueprint. "Mrs. Price said the city still owns the whole thing." "True." Zeke fingered brass key 7 in his pocket, its weight both reassuring and unsettling. "But we need to be extra careful. If we're caught, we're not doing anything wrong," Maya insisted. "The letters prove these pianos belong to the community. And look," she pulled out the original document they'd found. "It says, right here, authorized access via designated keys." Zeke smiled at his daughter's determination. She had her mother's spirit, that was certain. They waited until dusk settled over the town, the streets growing quiet as Sunday evening drew families indoors. The storage annex stood dark and silent, its weathered brick walls looming against the deepening purple sky. Zeke parked his truck around the corner, out of sight from the main road. Maya carried their flashlight, while he clutched a folder containing copies of all their documentation, just in case. "Remember what we discussed," he whispered as they approached the side door. "If anyone comes, I know, Dad. Straight back to the truck, no questions asked." The brass key slid into the lock with the same smooth precision as the others had. The door opened without a sound, revealing a dimly lit corridor. Their footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor as they made their way deeper into the building. The main storage area sprawled before them, illuminated by security lights filtering through high windows. At first glance it looked like any other warehouse until Maya's flashlight beam caught the edge of something covered in heavy dust cloths. Row after row of carefully draped shapes filled the space. Each one bore a tag similar to the one they'd found in the music hall. Zeke's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the nearest cloth. The polished ebony surface of a Steinway grand piano emerged, its finish still perfect after decades in storage. Maya gasped softly, her flashlight revealing more pianos as they moved deeper into the room. "They're all here," she whispered, just like the blueprint said. The air carried the sweet, familiar scent of cedar and furniture polish. Someone had taken extraordinary care to preserve these instruments. Each piano wore a metal tag with detailed information, serial numbers, dates, and maintenance notes spanning decades. "We need to document everything," Zeke said, already pulling out his phone to take pictures. But first, he dialed a number Mrs. Price had given him that morning, a regional piano appraiser she trusted. Despite the late hour, the man answered on the third ring. "Mr. Harrison? This is Ezekiel Carter. Mrs. Alberta Price gave me your number." Zeke's voice echoed slightly in the vast space. "I apologize for calling so late, but we've found something that needs your expertise." He described their discovery, reading off serial numbers and specifications from the tags. The appraiser's initial skepticism gave way to growing excitement as Zeke shared more details. "Mr. Carter, if what you're describing is accurate," the man's voice cracked slightly, "you're standing in front of one of the most significant historical piano collections I've ever heard of, the Model D concert grands alone, and you say there are upright models as well?" "Yes, sir. Multiple series, all Steinway, all from the same era. Based on just the numbers you've given me, we're looking at a conservative value of over $176 million for the entire collection, possibly much more, given the historical significance and documentation." Maya, who had been listening beside him, sat down hard on a nearby storage crate. Zeke had to lean against one of the pianos for support. "I'll need to see everything in person, of course," the appraiser continued, "but Mr. Carter, you need to secure that building immediately. A collection like this, well, let's just say it's going to attract attention." After ending the call, Zeke and Maya worked methodically to photograph every piano, every tag, every detail that might prove important. The security lights cast strange shadows as they moved through the rows, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Finally, with their documentation complete, they carefully replaced all the dust cloths exactly as they'd found them. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock behind them, sealing away their extraordinary discovery. The drive home passed in stunned silence. Maya stared out the window at the darkened streets, while Zeke's mind raced with implications he could barely grasp. $176 million. The number seemed impossible, unreal. At home, they sat at their kitchen table, still too wired to sleep. Rain began to fall outside, its gentle patter against the windows filling the quiet kitchen. Maya made hot chocolate while Zeke spread their photos across the table, trying to make sense of what they'd found. "Dad," Maya's voice was quiet but steady, "this is going to change things, isn't it?" Zeke looked at his daughter, seeing wisdom beyond her years in her eyes. "Yes, baby girl, I expect it will." The rain fell harder, drumming against the roof. Zeke gathered the photos into neat stacks, his movements deliberate and careful. The weight of their discovery pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd carried before. Monday morning arrived with a pale sun and an unfamiliar tension in the air. Zeke pulled into the school parking lot in his old pickup, toolbox ready for another day of fixing whatever needed attention. But something felt different the moment he stepped out of his truck. Two teachers near the entrance stopped talking when they saw him, their eyes following his progress across the asphalt. Inside, the usual morning bustle carried an undercurrent of whispers that died whenever he walked past. In the break room, Zeke found out why. Someone had left their phone on the counter, open to a local Facebook group. His name jumped out from the screen, breaking. "Janitor claims multi-million-dollar piano collection found in town storage. Developer Dean Whitford says property rights clear under existing lease." Zeke's coffee grew cold in his hand as he scrolled through the comments. Some expressed amazement at the discovery. Others questioned how a mere handyman could have any claim to such valuable instruments. A few suggested darker motives. "Morning, Zeke," said Mrs. Thompson, the art teacher, startling him. Her smile seemed forced. "Quite a story going around." "Seems that way," he replied carefully, pocketing his phone. He had 3 messages from Mrs. Price and 1 from the mayor's office. They would have to wait until his break. The morning dragged by in a fog of sideways glances and half-heard conversations. Zeke fixed a stuck locker, replaced fluorescent bulbs in the science lab, and unclogged a drinking fountain, normal tasks that now felt surreal against the weight of what he knew. During his lunch break, he finally checked his messages. The mayor's office wanted a preliminary discussion about the situation. Mrs. Price's texts were more urgent. Dean Whitford on local news claiming full rights to annex contents. "Come by after work. Bring all letters and documents. We need to move fast." As if summoned by her warning, Dean's smooth voice filled the break room when someone turned on the TV. He stood in front of the storage annex, looking concerned yet authoritative in an expensive suit. "While we appreciate Mr. Carter's interest in local history," Dean was saying, "the fact remains that our company holds a valid lease on the facility and its contents. We've been maintaining that space for months. Any items stored there fall under our contractual purview." The camera panned to show official-looking papers in Dean's hands. "We intend to preserve these instruments properly, perhaps as part of a new cultural center development. But let's be clear, this needs to be handled by professionals, not well-meaning amateurs." Zeke's phone buzzed again. The mayor's office wanted to meet that afternoon. He texted back that he'd be there after his shift, then returned to work with a heavy heart. The afternoon crawled by. More whispers, more stares. Even some of the students seemed to know something was up, pointing and giggling when he passed in the halls. By the time he left work, his shoulders ached from tension. The mayor's office was cool and quiet, but the atmosphere inside crackled with nervous energy. Mayor Jenkins sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, while the city attorney stood by the window. "Mr. Carter," the mayor began, "we find ourselves in a delicate situation. Mr. Whitford has presented some compelling documentation regarding his rights to the annex contents." "Sir," Zeke said, "those pianos were placed there long before any lease. We have letters." The city attorney cleared his throat. "Personal correspondence doesn't override legal contracts, Mr. Carter, unless you can prove clear ownership rights." "What about the trust mentioned in the letters?" Zeke asked. "The church committee from 1963? "We'd need much more than mentions in old letters," the attorney said. "Official documentation, legal filings, proof of an actual trust agreement." The mayor spread his hands. "For now, we're asking everyone to stay calm. No one is moving those pianos until this is sorted out properly." Zeke left feeling worse than before. The sun was setting when he pulled up to Mrs. Price's small Victorian house. She opened the door before he could knock, ushering him into her crowded living room. "Brought everything," he said, setting down his folder of documents. "But the mayor says—" "Never mind what the mayor says," Mrs. Price interrupted, already spreading papers across her coffee table. "We need to find proof of that trust. The letters mention meetings, decisions made. There must be records somewhere. They spent 2 hours going through every scrap of paper, every envelope, every margin note." Mrs. Price's sharp eyes caught details. Zeke had missed names, dates, references to other documents they didn't have. "The trust existed," she said firmly. "I remember people talking about it when I was younger. We just need to find the paper trail." It was past dinner time when Zeke finally made it home. Maya sat at the kitchen table, homework spread out before her, but her eyes were troubled. "Kids at school were talking," she said quietly, "about us, about the pianos." Zeke's heart clenched. He sat down beside her, pushing aside math worksheets to take her small hands in his. "Some of them said we were trying to steal them," Maya continued. "That we don't deserve nice things like that." She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, could we maybe keep just one piano, just for us?" Zeke pulled her into a tight hug, feeling her tears dampen his shirt. "Oh, baby girl, I promise you, I'm going to try. Those pianos belong to everyone in this town, including us. We just have to prove it." Later that night, after Maya had gone to bed, Zeke sat alone at Mrs. Moore's old upright. His fingers traced the worn keys, the scratched varnish, the crude scar on its back panel. In its imperfections, he saw both shame and dignity, the story of his people in this town, written in wood and wire. Pride swelled in his chest at what they'd discovered, at the trust placed in his hands through Mrs. Moore's final gift. But dread sat heavy in his stomach too. A cold weight that whispered of powerful men and their ways of taking things that didn't belong to them. The town council chamber buzzed with tension as people squeezed into every available seat. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of concerned citizens, and those who couldn't find seats lined the walls. The air felt thick with perfume, aftershave, and anxiety. Zeke sat in the front row between Mrs. Price and Pastor Leon, his folder of letters clutched tightly in his hands. Dean Whitford occupied a seat across the aisle, surrounded by men in expensive suits, his lawyers, Zeke assumed. They shuffled papers and whispered, occasionally casting sideways glances his way. Clara Davenport called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Her silver hair caught the fluorescent light as she adjusted her reading glasses. "This emergency session of the town council will now come to order," she announced, her voice carrying authority earned from 12 years on the council. "We're here to address the matter of certain musical instruments recently discovered in municipal storage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara raised her hand for silence. "We'll hear first from Mr. Ezekiel Carter, who brought this matter to our attention." Zeke stood, straightening his tie, borrowed from Pastor Leon for the occasion. His work boots seemed too loud on the polished floor as he approached the podium. The microphone squealed slightly when he adjusted it. "Thank you, Councilmember Davenport," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "Last week, I inherited a piano from the late Mrs. Lillian Moore. Inside it, we found letters and documents dating back to 1963. He opened his folder with careful movements, trying to ignore the whispers behind him. The first letter crinkled as he unfolded it. "This is from James Marshall, a concert pianist who traveled through our town during the civil rights movement." Zeke's voice grew stronger as he read, "The instruments must be protected. We hereby establish a trust for their safekeeping, to be administered by the AME Church Committee for the benefit of all who seek music's solace." Dean's lawyer cleared his throat loudly. Zeke continued, pulling out another letter. "Here's correspondence from Steinway, Sons in New York, confirming the collection's value and supporting the trust's formation. They recognized the importance of preserving these instruments during a difficult time in our history." Clara leaned forward. "Do you have the actual trust documents, Mr. Carter?" "We're still searching for some papers, ma'am, but these letters prove nothing legally binding," Dean interrupted, standing smoothly. "May I approach, Councilmember Davenport?" Clara nodded, and Dean strode to the podium. He wore an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than Zeke's truck. While Mr. Carter's "Folk tales are certainly interesting," Dean said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "the legal reality is quite simple. My company holds a valid lease on the storage facility and its contents." Section 12. Paragraph B clearly states, "Those pianos were there long before your lease," Mrs. Price called out from her seat. "Please," Clara warned, "no interruptions." Dean's smile widened. "As I was saying, the lease grants us full rights to any and all contents within the facility. Furthermore, our company has been paying insurance and climate control costs to protect these valuable items. Mr. Carter's claims, while creative, have no legal standing." He produced a thick stack of documents. "I have here our lease agreement, insurance policies, and maintenance records, all properly filed and notarized." The council members passed the papers among themselves, examining them with furrowed brows. Zeke felt his heart sink as he watched their faces. Pastor Leon stood then, his quiet dignity drawing all eyes. "If I may speak?" Clara gestured for him to proceed. "These instruments represent more than property rights," he said, his deep voice filling the chamber. "They're part of our town's soul. During the civil rights era, when black churches and businesses faced threats of violence, good people, both black and white, worked together to preserve these pianos. They represent hope, unity, and faith in better days." A few heads nodded in the crowd. Even Clara's expression softened slightly. "That's very moving, Pastor," Dean said, "but sentiment doesn't override contract law. If there was a trust, where's the paperwork? Where are the legal filings? Surely something so important would have been properly documented." Documents can be lost, Mrs. Price spoke up again, or hidden, or destroyed. But memory endures. I was there when these decisions were made. I remember the names, the dates, the promises. Hearsay? One of Dean's lawyers muttered loudly enough to be heard. Tension crackled in the room. Some council members shifted uncomfortably as the racial undertones became impossible to ignore. Clara tapped her gavel again. I think we need more concrete evidence before making any decisions. Mr. Carter, do you have anything else to present at this time? Zeke looked down at his folder of letters. Not yet, ma'am, but we're still searching. Then I suggest we table this discussion until more documentation can be found. Clara's voice was firm but not unkind. In the meantime, the instruments will remain sealed in the storage facility. No one is to access them without council approval. We'll reconvene when there's new evidence to consider. The crowd began to disperse, their discussions filling the chamber with a low buzz. Dean and his lawyers gathered their papers, looking pleased. Zeke stood by the podium feeling deflated. Pastor Leon approached and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Son, he said quietly, truth is patient, but we'll need to help it along. The old AME church glowed with warmth on that crisp Saturday evening. String lights twinkled in the trees along the walkway, and the autumn breeze carried the sweet scents of hot apple cider and fresh-baked pies from the refreshment tables set up outside. Church members had decorated the entrance with fall flowers and ribbons, transforming the historic building into something magical. Inside, two gleaming Steinway grand pianos commanded attention at the front of the sanctuary. Their polished ebony surfaces reflected the soft lighting, making them look like black mirrors. Earlier that day, professional tuners had worked for hours to restore their voices to perfection. Zeke stood near the back, watching people file in. The pews filled quickly with a mix of faces he rarely saw together: elderly church members in their Sunday best, curious townspeople, music lovers from neighboring communities who'd read about the concert in the paper. Veterans from the VFW hall sat together, their medals catching the light. Even some of the council members had shown up, including Clara Davenport, who sat primly in a middle pew. Mrs. Price bustled about in a purple dress and matching hat, greeting people with the energy of someone half her age. "Welcome, welcome," she called out. "Programs are by the door. Donations for the Preservation Fund are entirely voluntary." Maya peeked out from the side room where performers were gathering. She wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, carefully altered by Mrs. Price. Her small hands twisted nervously in front of her as she caught Zeke's eye. He gave her an encouraging smile and a thumbs up. She disappeared back behind the door, and his heart swelled with pride. His daughter, who usually shied away from attention, had volunteered to play tonight. Pastor Leon stepped up to the pulpit as the clock struck 7. "Friends, neighbors, music lovers," he began, his rich voice filling the space. "Tonight is about more than beautiful instruments. It's about memory, community, and healing." The sanctuary grew still as he spoke about the history of the pianos, their protection during troubled times, and the hope they represented. "These keys have waited patiently to sing again," he said. "Tonight they will." The first performers were a pair of elderly sisters who'd played duets in this very church 60 years ago. Their fingers, though slower now, still found the familiar paths through a Bach piece that brought tears to many eyes. Next came a local music teacher, then a visiting pianist from the State University. When Maya's turn came, Zeke held his breath. She walked to the piano with measured steps, just as Mrs. Price had taught her. The sanctuary was silent as she settled onto the bench, her feet barely reaching the pedals. She began to play "His Eye is on the Sparrow," but with a gentle touch that made the old hymn sound new. The Steinway's voice rang true and clear, filling every corner of the church with warmth. Halfway through she began to sing softly, her young voice pure and unafraid. "I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free." Several older church members joined in, their voices harmonizing with hers. Soon the whole congregation was singing, the sound swelling until it seemed the very walls vibrated with joy. Zeke noticed Clara Davenport dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. Maya blushed and hurried back to her seat, but not before Zeke saw her proud smile. More performers followed, each adding their own magic to the evening. The music ranged from classical to gospel, from jazz to contemporary pieces, showing the versatility of these magnificent instruments. Between performances, people dropped donations into the carved wooden boxes by the doors. A reporter from the local paper took photos and notes, paying special attention when Mrs. Price shared stories about the collection's history. Even some of Dean's usual supporters were nodding along, moved by the music and the meaning behind it. Dean himself stood in the shadows near the back door, his expression unreadable as he watched the community come together. He left before the final number, when the entire congregation stood to sing Amazing Grace, accompanied by both pianos. After the concert, people lingered, sharing pie and cider, swapping stories, and examining the pianos up close. The atmosphere was electric with possibility. Clara Davenport approached Zeke, her usual businesslike demeanor softened. "Your daughter plays beautifully," she said. "And these instruments, I had no idea they could sound like this. They just needed a chance to be heard," Zeke replied. She nodded thoughtfully before moving away to speak with Pastor Leon. As the crowd thinned and the evening grew late, Zeke and Maya walked home together under the streetlights. The autumn air had grown cooler, and Maya hugged her father's jacket around her shoulders. Their footsteps echoed on the quiet sidewalk. "You made a lot of people happy tonight," Zeke said, looking down at his daughter. Maya smiled up at him. The piano helped. It wanted to sing again. That it did. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "We gave them a reason to remember." Monday morning dawned gray and chilly. Frost sparkled on windshields, and people's breath came out in white puffs as they hurried to start their days. Zeke's old pickup truck rumbled through the quiet streets, its heater working overtime against the cold. Maya sat beside him, clutching her backpack and violin case. "Don't forget your math homework this time," Zeke reminded her, pulling up to the school's front entrance. Students bundled in winter coats streamed toward the doors. "I won't," Maya promised. She hesitated before opening the door. "Dad, are you okay?" Zeke managed to smile. "Course I am, sweetheart. Saturday's concert was something special, wasn't it?" Maya's face brightened. "Mrs. Price said we raised over $2,000. "That we did." He watched her hop down from the truck. "Have a good day, baby girl." She waved and joined the flow of students. Zeke waited until she disappeared inside before pulling away, heading toward his maintenance job at the VFW hall. The morning radio crackled with news about weekend sports and weather, but his mind wandered to the Steinways. Maybe they could arrange more concerts, start music lessons for kids who couldn't afford them. His thoughts scattered when he turned onto Market Street. 3 sheriff's department trucks were parked outside the municipal annex, their lights flashing silently in the morning gloom. Deputies in brown uniforms stood around the loading dock, and a small crowd had gathered across the street. Zeke's stomach clenched. He pulled over, hands tight on the steering wheel. 2 deputies were directing a moving crew as they wheeled out the first piano on a specially padded dolly. The Steinway's protective cover couldn't hide its elegant shape. More movers emerged with equipment designed for transporting delicate instruments. Dean Whitford stood near the entrance, tablet in hand, checking items off a list. His designer coat and leather gloves looked out of place among the working men's heavy jackets. When he spotted Zeke getting out of his truck, a small smile played across his face. "What's going on here?" Zeke asked, approaching the nearest deputy. The officer held up a hand. "Stay back, sir. We're executing an emergency court order to secure these items pending investigation." "Investigation of what?" "The authenticity of certain documents," Dean cut in smoothly, walking over. He held up his tablet, showing a legal document with an official seal. The court has concerns about potentially forged historical materials. We're moving the collection to a secure facility until ownership can be properly established. Zeke's chest tightened. Forged? Those letters are real. Mrs. Price confirmed, hearsay and sentiment aren't admissible evidence, Mr. Carter. Dean's voice carried just enough for the gathering crowd to hear. We need proper authentication, given the value involved. Surely you understand the need for due diligence? The way he said it made Zeke's skin crawl. More onlookers had gathered, phones out, recording everything. Dean was playing to the audience, his concerned expression masking something harder in his eyes. Where are you taking them? Zeke demanded. That information is confidential, for security reasons, a deputy answered. Please step back behind the yellow tape, sir. Zeke watched helplessly as piano after piano emerged from the annex. Each one disappeared into the back of a climate-controlled truck secured by professional art movers. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Mrs. Price or Pastor Leon hearing the news. But he couldn't look away from the systematic dismantling of their discovery. I've already posted a statement on behalf of the development company, Dean said, loud enough for nearby phones to pick up. We're deeply concerned about possible fraud, but committed to protecting these historical treasures while the investigation proceeds. Zeke's hands curled into fists. You know those letters are genuine. Do I? Dean raised an eyebrow. The timing seems awfully convenient. A janitor suddenly discovers millions in antique pianos right when development plans are being finalized? He shook his head sadly. The court will sort it out. By now, Zeke's phone was buzzing constantly. He finally pulled it out to find a flood of notifications. Local news sites were running stories with headlines like "Questions raised about piano collection claims" and "Developer moves to secure disputed instruments." Social media was worse. Accusations and theories, spreading like wildfire. Someone had posted close-ups of the letters, marking suspicious similarities in the handwriting. Another claimed the blueprint was drawn on paper that wasn't available in the 1960s. None of it was true. But truth seemed to matter less than sensation. Dean's company page had already shared a professionally written statement promising a full investigation while expressing disappointment that someone would attempt to manipulate our community's history for personal gain. The comments were filling with angry reactions from people who hadn't even been at Saturday's concert. Zeke felt sick. He was going to be late for work, but his feet wouldn't move. One by one, the trucks pulled away with their precious cargo. The crowd thinned as the excitement wore off, leaving him almost alone on the sidewalk. Dean approached one last time, his voice low. You should have taken the hint when we told you that piano was worthless. Now look what you've started. He straightened his coat. Have a good day, Mr. Carter. The morning passed in a blur. Zeke went through the motions at work, barely hearing the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. His phone kept buzzing until he turned it off. By afternoon, even the VFW regulars were giving him careful looks. Evening found him at home, warming up leftover spaghetti for dinner. Maya sat at the kitchen table, pushing pasta around her plate. She hadn't said much since he picked her up from school, where kids had already been talking about their parents' social media posts. Dad? She finally asked, her voice small. Have we lost everything? Zeke put down his fork. His daughter's eyes held too much worry for a 10-year-old. He thought of the empty annex, the online accusations, the way Dean had orchestrated it all, like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. He forced a smile he didn't feel. The story isn't over yet, baby girl. But even as he said it, doubt clouded his eyes, and he knew Maya could see it. They ate the rest of their dinner in silence, the old upright piano in the living room standing like a silent witness to their uncertainty. The autumn sun cast long shadows through Zeke's living room windows when Mrs. Price's gentle knock echoed at the front door. She stood on the porch, a wicker basket over one arm and determination in her eyes. Thought you might need some comfort food, she said, stepping inside. The basket held still warm biscuits and her special blend of tea, and maybe a fresh perspective. Zeke helped her to the worn armchair near the piano. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He hadn't slept well since the seizure. Maya was at violin practice, the house quiet except for the tick of the old wall clock. "The whole town's talking," he said, slumping onto the couch. "Dean's got everyone believing I made it all up." Mrs. Price arranged teacups on the coffee table, her movements precise despite her arthritis. "People believe what's easy, not what's true, but truth has patience we can't imagine." She poured the tea, the rich aroma filling the room. "Speaking of which, I've been doing some remembering." Zeke reached for a biscuit, still warm under the checkered cloth. "About what?" "Those letters we found." She settled back, teacup balanced perfectly in her weathered hands. "I kept thinking about the little notes in the margins. Numbers, mostly. Thought they were dates at first, but one caught my eye. 187. "Just another number," Zeke said, the disappointment of recent days heavy in his voice. Mrs. Price's eyes sparkled. "Not just any number, child. In our old hymnals, 187 is blessed assurance. Been that way since before I was born." She took a careful sip of tea. "And we kept every hymnal ever used in that church. Every single one." Zeke sat straighter. "You think?" "I think people who hide precious things often leave breadcrumbs." She set down her cup. "And I think it's time we went hunting in the church attic." Within 30 minutes they were climbing the narrow stairs to the AME church's attic. Pastor Leon had given them the key without questions, just a knowing nod. The space smelled of old wood and decades of dust, with weak light filtering through small windows. "Lord have mercy." Mrs. Price wheezed, steadying herself on a roof beam. "I haven't been up here in 20 years. Zeke pulled out his phone for light, sweeping the beam across stacked boxes and old furniture. "Where would they keep hymnals?" "Back corner, Mrs." Price pointed. "We never threw them out, just boxed them up when new ones came in. They worked methodically through the afternoon." Dust danced in the phone's light as they opened box after box. Old Sunday school materials, Christmas pageant costumes, faded bulletins from services long past. Mrs. Price commented on each discovery, weaving stories of church history as they searched. "Here's another box of hymnals," Zeke called out, pulling a cardboard container from behind a rolled-up rug. The books inside were bound in faded red cloth, their pages yellow with age. Mrs. Price settled onto an old chair they'd cleared. "Check the numbers inside the covers. They should be stamped." Zeke's fingers moved carefully through the stack. 142, 165, 181. He paused, brushing dust from a particularly worn volume. "Wait." The number 187 was stamped in fading ink on the hymnal's inside cover. Unlike the others, this one had a slight bulge to its spine, as if something was pressed between its pages. "This is it," Mrs. Price whispered. "Open it careful now." Zeke turned to him. 187, blessed assurance. There, nestled in the center fold, was a small envelope wrapped in oilcloth. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, crisp despite its age. The trustee's signature page they'd been missing, complete with a city clerk's stamp from 1964. A carbon copy was attached, providing duplicate proof of the document's authenticity. Mrs. Price leaned forward, squinting at the paper. "Would you look at that? That's Judge Thompson's signature right there. He was on the city council back then. And Reverend Marshall's, too." Her finger traced the names. These people, they knew what they were protecting. Zeke could barely breathe. Here was the proof, official, stamped, and witnessed, that the Steinway collection had been legally entrusted to the church's care. The missing piece that could undo Dean's claims of forgery. "There's something else," Mrs. Price said, pointing to a small envelope that had fallen from the oilcloth. It was addressed simply, "To the future caretaker." Inside was a single line of text, written in careful script: "Music is not a commodity. It is a covenant." They sat in the dusty attic light, surrounded by decades of church history, holding the key to their community's musical heritage. "Mrs." Price reached over and squeezed Zeke's hand. "Now," she said, her voice firm with conviction, "we can bring the truth to light." The October morning painted the courthouse steps in golden light. A light frost still clung to the edges of the stone, making everything sparkle. Reporters huddled in small groups, their breath visible in the crisp air, cameras and notepads at the ready. Zeke tugged at his tie, the same one he'd worn to Maya's first violin recital. His best suit felt tight across the shoulders, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd needed to dress up. But today wasn't about comfort. Today was about truth. Pastor Leon's steady hand landed on his shoulder. "Remember what we practiced," he said quietly. "Just tell it straight and true." Behind them, Mrs. Price sat in her wheelchair, wrapped in her Sunday best, a purple dress and matching hat she saved for special occasions. Two nurses from her assisted living facility had helped her get ready at dawn, knowing she wouldn't miss this day for anything. The veterans from the VFW hall formed a protective semicircle around their small group. Some wore their service medals, others just their VFW caps, but all stood tall. They'd come without being asked, showing up at Zeke's house that morning as if summoned by an unspoken signal. "Got your back, brother," said Jim Thompson, a Vietnam vet who'd helped Zeke load the piano that first day. About time this town faced some truth. Camera flashes popped as they approached the courthouse doors. Reporters called out questions, their voices overlapping. "Mr. Carter, what do you say to accusations of forgery? Is it true the collection's worth nearly $200 million? Will you sell if you win?" Zeke kept his eyes forward, just like Pastor Leon had coached him. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, releasing a burst of warm air from inside. The courthouse lobby smelled of furniture polish and old paper, its marble floors echoing with their footsteps. Their lawyer, Sarah Chen, met them by the elevator. She carried a worn leather briefcase stuffed with documents, the original letters, the trust paperwork, and, most importantly, the signed page from the hymnal. Her calm smile steadied Zeke's nerves. "Everything's in order," she said, pressing the elevator button. "Just remember, let the documents speak for themselves." The courtroom on the third floor was already packed. Dean Whitford sat at the defendant's table in an expensive charcoal suit, his legal team spread out beside him like a wall of dark suits and leather portfolios. He didn't look back when Zeke's group entered. Clara Davenport sat in the front row, her silver hair perfect as always, her face set in lines of determination. She nodded slightly as Zeke passed. In the week since they'd found the signature page, she'd spent hours in the town archives, uncovering more evidence of the original trust's legitimacy. Judge Martha Wilson entered, her robe swishing as she took her seat. The roomful of people rose and sat in a wave of rustling fabric. "Carter versus Whitford Development, regarding ownership and disposition of the Steinway collection," the clerk announced. "All parties present?" Sarah Chen stood. "Present for the plaintiff, Your Honor." Dean's lead attorney, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipped accent, rose next. "Present for the defendant." The morning unfolded in a careful dance of legal procedure. Sarah presented the complete trust documentation, building the story piece by piece. The original letters establishing the collection's purpose. Photographs of the instruments' serial numbers, matching the inventory lists. Property records showing the church's continuous operation since before the trust was created. Then came the testimony. Mrs. Price spoke first, her voice thin but clear as she recounted the history she'd witnessed firsthand. "Those pianos weren't just instruments," she said. "They were hope made solid. When our buildings were being threatened with arson, when our children were being told they didn't deserve beautiful things, those Steinways reminded us that art belongs to everyone." Dean's lawyer tried to shake her testimony. suggesting her memory might be clouded by age. Mrs. Price fixed him with a stern look that made him step back. "Young man," she said, "I may not remember what I had for breakfast, but some things sink into your bones and stay there. This is one of them." Clara's testimony came as a surprise to many in the room. She stood straight-backed at the witness stand, her voice steady as she spoke. "My family has been in real estate in this town for 3 generations," she began. "And I have to acknowledge that we were part of the problem. We supported policies that pushed the black community to the margins. We looked the other way when their properties were undervalued or their loans denied." She paused, removing her reading glasses to look directly at the judge. "When I first heard about this collection, I thought it was a fairy tale. But I've seen the evidence. I've read every document. This trust was created legally and with clear purpose, to protect not just the instruments, but the dignity of a community that refused to be denied access to art and culture." Dean's lawyer tried to argue that the lease agreement superseded any prior claims, but Sarah methodically demolished that argument, pointing out that the trust had never been legally dissolved, making the lease invalid for those specific assets. Throughout it all, Zeke sat quietly, his hands folded on the table. He thought about Maya, who was in school right now, probably unable to focus on her lessons. He thought about his late wife, who had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. He thought about Mrs. Moore, wondering if she had known what she was passing on when she willed him that broken piano. Just before noon, Judge Wilson called for a recess to review all the documentation before making her final ruling. The courtroom slowly emptied, conversations buzzing as people filed out. Zeke stepped outside onto the courthouse steps, loosening his tie slightly. The morning frost had melted, leaving the stone warm under the midday sun. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, but for the first time in weeks, that pounding was touched with hope. Pastor Leon appeared beside him, offering a bottle of water. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "you've already won something important. You showed this town what dignity looks like." Zeke took a slow sip of water, feeling the autumn breeze on his face as they waited for the judge's decision. The next morning, every seat in the courtroom was filled. The air felt thick with anticipation. Zeke's tie felt even tighter than yesterday, and his palms were sweaty as he sat at the plaintiff's table. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Price's soft humming. It sounded like, "His eye is on the sparrow." Judge Wilson entered, her face unreadable as she took her seat. The rustling of papers and whispered conversations died instantly. After careful review of all evidence presented, she began, her voice clear and measured. "This court finds the following. First, the original trust establishing the Steinway collection as a cultural heritage asset was properly executed and never legally dissolved." She paused, adjusting her reading glasses. Zeke held his breath. "Second, the subsequent lease agreement cited by the defendant cannot override the prior trust's legitimate claim. Therefore, this court rules that the Steinway collection, in its entirety, legally belongs to the church's charitable trust as originally established." The courtroom erupted in applause. Mrs. Price's "Amen" rang out above the noise. Pastor Leon squeezed Zeke's shoulder so hard it almost hurt. Judge Wilson rapped her gavel. "Order, please. There are additional stipulations to be addressed." As the room quieted, Zeke stood, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Your Honor, if I may?" She nodded, and he pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. He'd stayed up late writing this, wanting to get the words exactly right. "The trust was created to bring music and dignity to our community," he said. "We propose establishing a community conservatory, free lessons for children and seniors, apprenticeships for veterans who want to learn piano restoration, annual civil rights concerts to honor our history." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "This isn't about profit. It's about healing old wounds and building something new." something that belongs to everyone. From the defendant's table, Dean Whitford stood up. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Your Honor," he said, straightening his tie, "I'd like to offer funding for this conservatory as restitution. My company will provide space in our renovated downtown building, plus operational costs for the first 5 years." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Zeke studied Dean's face, looking for any trace of his usual manipulation, but the developer's eyes were clear, his expression open. "Under strict transparency," Zeke responded. "With a community oversight board." "Agreed," Dean said quietly. "It's time to make things right." Clara Davenport rose from her seat, her silver hair catching the morning light. "Your Honor, I volunteer to spearhead public support for this initiative. The Town Council can establish a matching fund for ongoing maintenance of the collection." Judge Wilson nodded approvingly. "The court accepts these proposals as additional terms of the settlement. Mr. Carter, as trustee, you'll need to file detailed plans within 30 days. She rapped her gavel one final time. "Court is adjourned." The room burst into movement and sound. People hugged. Some were crying. Mrs. Price was surrounded by well-wishers, her purple hat bobbing as she received congratulations. Pastor Leon was already on his phone, presumably calling the church secretary to spread the news. Sarah Chen gathered their papers, beaming. "We'll start the paperwork this afternoon." "This is going to change lives, Zeke." Dean approached cautiously, extending his hand. "I meant what I said. Let me help make this right." Zeke hesitated only a moment before shaking it. "For the music," he said firmly. "For the music," Dean agreed. Clara joined them, already pulling out her phone. "We should schedule a planning meeting. The old Marshall building downtown would be perfect. Good acoustics, centrally located. We could start renovations next month." As they talked logistics, Zeke's thoughts drifted to Maya. He couldn't wait to tell her the news. That evening, after all the meetings and phone calls and congratulations, Zeke finally made it home. Maya was waiting on the porch, practically bouncing with excitement. She'd heard the news at school and could barely contain herself. "Daddy, is it true? We won? We really won?" He scooped her up in a hug, even though she was getting almost too big for that. "We sure did, baby girl. Want to help me celebrate?" They went inside to the upright piano, the one that had started it all. Its scratched surface caught the last rays of sunset coming through the window. Zeke ran his hand along the wood, remembering how people had mocked him for accepting it. "This old piano knew what it was doing," he said softly. "It was just waiting for the right time to share its secret." Maya sat beside him on the bench, her shoulder pressing against his arm. Together, they opened the fallboard, revealing the keys that had hidden so much history. "What should we play?" she asked. "How about that duet we've been practicing?" Their fingers found their places on the keys. The piano's voice rang out warm and true, filling their small living room with music. Maya giggled when Zeke missed a note, and he laughed too, their joy mixing with the melody. The broken piano that had once brought mockery now sang with purpose, its music carrying the promise of everything to come. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Carter Price Conservatory, casting warm patterns across the polished wooden floors. The renovated Marshall building sparkled with new life on this crisp spring morning. Fresh paint brightened its historic brick walls, and golden letters above the entrance proclaimed its new purpose. People filed into the grand performance hall, their voices a happy buzz of anticipation. Veterans in pressed uniforms stood tall, near the front rows, their medals catching the light. Church elders in their Sunday best settled into cushioned seats, programs rustling in their hands. Children fidgeted excitedly, their parents gently shushing them. Zeke adjusted his tie in a quiet corner, watching it all unfold. The past year felt like a dream. Countless meetings, renovation decisions, and late nights planning programs. Now, seeing the results, his chest felt tight with emotion. Mrs. Price appeared beside him, resplendent in a royal purple dress and matching hat. "Look at what grew from that broken piano," she said, patting his arm. "Just look at what the Lord can do with willing hands." The main hall was a symphony of restoration. Gleaming Steinways, each with its own story, lined the walls in various stages of repair. Some showed the careful work of veteran apprentices learning the craft of piano restoration. Others stood pristine, ready for lessons and performances. But the centerpiece, displayed behind crystal-clear glass near the stage, was the old, upright Mrs. Moore's piano that had started it all. Its surface still bore the marks of its journey, but now they told a different story. A brass plaque beneath it read, "What was meant to shame became our song." Clara Davenport approached, her heels clicking on the hardwood. "The governor's aide just arrived," she said, "and 3 newspaper photographers. Are we ready to begin?" Zeke nodded, straightening his shoulders. "Maya's been practicing for weeks. She's ready." The lights dimmed slightly, drawing everyone to their seats. Pastor Leon stepped to the podium, his warm smile visible even from the back row. "Friends, neighbors, honored guests," he began, "we gather today to celebrate more than just a building or a collection of instruments. We celebrate the power of truth to outlast lies, of love to overcome fear, and of music to heal old wounds." He gestured to the display case. "That humble piano behind me carried secrets that changed our town. But the real miracle wasn't in what it held, it was in what it revealed about us. About who we could be when we chose to listen to each other." Dean Whitford, standing near the back, nodded solemnly. His company's logo was small and modest on the donor wall, exactly as agreed. The ribbon cutting was brief but meaningful. Mrs. Price's steady hands held one end of the scissors while Maya held the other. Together, they cut the red ribbon as cameras flashed and applause filled the hall. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Maya, in a yellow dress that seemed to capture the morning sun, walked to the centerpiece Steinway. Her steps were sure, her head held high. Gone was the shy girl who used to hide behind her father. In her place stood a young musician, ready to share her gift. She settled onto the bench, took a deep breath, and began to play. The piece was "His Eye is on the Sparrow," arranged specially for this day, weaving classical techniques through the beloved spiritual. The notes rose clear and strong, filling every corner of the hall with their promise. The elders began to hum along softly, their voices adding depth to the melody. Veterans stood straighter, some wiping their eyes discreetly. Children stopped fidgeting, caught in the magic of the moment. Zeke watched his daughter play, remembering all the nights she'd practiced on their old upright at home. How far they'd come from those first days of mockery and doubt. Now Maya's fingers danced across keys that belonged to everyone and no one. Keys that would teach generations of children the power of music. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence before the applause began. Maya stood and curtsied, her smile bright enough to light up the room. Mrs. Price was the first to her feet, clapping and calling out, "Praise him." Others joined until the whole hall was standing. The formal program flowed into a reception. People mingled, enjoying punch and cookies while exploring the building. Veterans proudly showed off their restoration projects to curious visitors. Children gathered around the practice rooms, peeking in at the pianos they would soon learn to play. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the crowds thinned. Sunset painted the town square in soft oranges and pinks, visible through the conservatory's western windows. The last notes of impromptu performances echoed through the halls. Zeke found himself at a window, watching people stroll across the square. The sound of laughter and music drifted up from below, where some children were playing near the fountain. Mrs. Price joined him, her presence as comforting as always. They stood in companionable silence, watching the scene below. "We didn't just find pianos," Zeke murmured at last. "We found our voice." She smiled, her eyes bright with wisdom and joy. "And it will keep singing long after us. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.